dress whites, brass buttons catching the sun, a ribbon rack that tells a lifetime of service, dog tags clinking against a chest that had pulled strangers from the water under enemy fire. And then, on hot concrete beside an ordinary gas pump, a man in uniform is ordered to kneel. What happened next? Recorded by 8 cameras and at least 7 phones, verified by uniform experts and RFID scans, and escalated up a military and federal chain of command within days, forced an unprecedented federal response. Within 72 hours, the Department of Justice had opened a civil rights investigation. The Pentagon was briefing senior officials, and the county sheriff's office, the Navy, and the nation were forced to reckon with a single question. How could a decorated active-duty Navy officer in full dress be treated that way? Before we go further, if this story strikes you, drop a comment below about whether you've ever been judged before anyone knew your name, and consider subscribing for more investigations like this. Stay with us. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes had spent years wearing that uniform in the worst conditions America asks of its sailors. His record, on paper and in the memories of colleagues, read like a career of steady courage. Multiple deployments, a combat rescue under fire that earned him a valor distinction, and years of leadership at sea. On the morning the cameras rolled, he was homebound. He had polished his dress whites for a memorial visit, for a family dinner with his mother. The uniform he wore that day carried a history you could read in its thread and metal. Medals, a deployment patch, the dog tags that every service member carries close to the skin. The man who stopped him at the pump was Deputy Kyle Brennan of the county sheriff's office. On paper, Brennan was a law enforcement officer with years on the force. In the months that followed, investigators would uncover a very different pattern: 5 prior complaints, each raising concerns that the department had not adequately resolved. Those complaints, taken alone on file, meant little. Put beside visible, time-stamped video of an arrest, they began to look like a dangerous pattern. The incident itself can be reconstructed like a short, brutal sequence. Multiple camera angles capture the same arc from different vantage points. A dash cam, 4 station security cameras, and 7 witness phones picked up overlapping fragments. Hayes pulls into the pump, uniform pristine, medals and ribbons visible. A nearby veteran, an unarmed Marine reservist waiting with coffee, looks up and recognizes a brother in service. Someone at the store glances through the glass. Then the deputy approaches. Police procedure typically begins with a question. The deputy asked for identification. Hayes reached for his wallet and produced his military ID, his dog tags, and deployment paperwork. Those items were visible in the videos, the holographic elements on the Navy ID, the metal of the dog tags, the seal on deployment orders. Hayes put his hands where the deputy could see them. He complied. What the videos show next is jarring, because it contradicts a basic expectation. A cooperative, clearly identified service member should not be reduced to the posture of a suspect. Orders from the deputy escalated rapidly. Hayes was told to kneel. Hands that had been steady during combat now touched hot pavement. Handcuffs clicked. Witnesses raised phones. One bystander, a United States Marine veteran, placed a hand over his heart. Another shouted, incredulous. The gas station owner later described feeling sick in his stomach. The arresting deputy's radio chatter and body language can be heard in some footage, in others, only the aftermath. The sequence of custody and transfer that followed is where procedure and recognition finally intersected. Hayes was brought to the county booking facility. Sergeant Mike Torres was on duty in booking. Torres, himself a career law enforcement professional, watched the footage and looked at the uniform. He recognized the Navy dress uniform for what it was. Torres asked for verification. The booking process has specific checks for active duty identification. A look at the hologram, a scan that can detect embedded RFID markers that many modern military IDs contain, a check against deployment orders. Torres followed those steps. In about 45 seconds, Torres had confirmed Hayes' active duty status. He removed the handcuffs. That moment, caught on body cam and in booking logs, became the pivot. The humiliation had already happened, the kneeling in public, the cuffs, the watchful, judging eyes of fellow citizens. But the procedural correction exposed a deeper failure. An officer of the law had used his authority to detain a man who had demonstrated within seconds he was who he said he was. What followed was an institutional escalation that traces the path emergency events are supposed to take. Torres alerted Naval Station Norfolk to report a potential wrongful arrest of an active duty sailor. The Navy elevated the matter up its chain. Within 72 hours, the Pentagon had been notified, and federal prosecutors were examining the case. The Department of Justice, which has authority to bring civil rights charges when an official acting under color of law violates someone's federally protected rights, opened an investigation. Plainly stated, deprivation of rights under color of law is a federal statute used when a public official uses the power of their office to violate constitutional protections, often involving wrongful arrest, excessive force, or discrimination. It's not a local administrative matter. It is a tool Congress gave federal prosecutors to hold accountable those who abuse office. In this case, prosecutors brought a package of charges that included deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and assault on a military service member, the latter reflecting the unique status of Hayes as an active duty member. Prosecutors' case did not rely simply on one phone video. It was a mosaic, 8 camera angles that overlapped and corroborated each other, forensic verification of identity through a holographic ID check and RFID scans, testimony from a uniform expert who explained to the jury how dress whites and ribbons are authorized and recognizable, and witness statements from those who had been at the pump. Crucially, investigators also pulled prior complaints filed against Deputy Brennan. There were 5 separate reports on file, allegations that ranged across misconduct and excessive force. Historically, those complaints had been closed without criminal action. Alone, they were administrative blips. Paired with the gas station footage and with the forensic confirmations, they formed a pattern prosecutors argued was probative of a deeper issue, a tendency by the deputy to make on-the-spot judgments that escalated to force. The videos, played in sequence for jurors and eventually for the public, have an almost unbearable clarity. One angle shows Hayes producing his military ID. A different angle, closer, catches the glint on the hologram under daylight. Another camera reveals the deputy's posture at the precise moment he gives the command to kneel. A phone video records the Marine veteran's reaction, raw and unfiltered. Layered audio gives the deputy's words, Hayes's compliance, and the murmurs of bystanders. In court, an expert used ultraviolet light to show the ID's security features. An RFID reader produced a match to an active duty registry. The combination of modern forensic checks and simple citizen footage created a chain of evidence prosecutors described as difficult to refute. The man was in uniform. He presented valid, verifiable proof. Yet he was treated like a suspect. Beyond the evidence itself, the public story unfolded rapidly. The first clips hit social media, and then a montage appeared online that compiled the multiple angles. Views climbed exponentially, tens of thousands in the first hour, hundreds of thousands by the end of the day, and millions within 48 hours as national outlets picked up the footage. Veterans groups were swift to respond, organizing statements and demanding accountability. Civil rights organizations called for federal investigation. The fact that this arrest involved a decorated service member in dress uniform added resonance. If a man with medals and a clear record could be treated this way in public, what did that imply about routine encounters between citizens and police? The legal arc that followed moved from investigation to indictment to trial. Federal prosecutors filed charges against Deputy Brennan, focusing on deprivation of rights under color of law among other counts. The indictment also referenced the deputy's prior complaints as relevant background. In selecting a jury, the court included veterans, including several with military backgrounds, a fact both sides acknowledged shaped the deliberative dynamic in the courtroom. Men and women who had worn similar uniforms and understood the symbolic weight of dress whites sat in judgment. Courtroom evidence was technical and human in equal measure. Forensic technicians demonstrated the ID's holographic elements under UV light, and the RFID reader registered the digital identifiers tied to Hayes's records. A uniform specialist walked the jury through the placement and meaning of ribbons, insignia, and the standard appearance of dress whites, underscoring that Hayes's attire was not a costume but institutional gear. Hayes himself testified calmly. He described the day in quiet, measured tones, recounting that he had followed the deputy's requests and that he had felt, in that kneel on hot concrete, the sting of humiliation, despite years of carrying much worse. Family members' statements and the testimony of onlookers added texture. Hayes was not the type to escalate, those who knew him said. He had obeyed. The defense sought to portray its client's actions as reasonable suspicion on a traffic stop or a confrontation driven by uncertainty. Prosecutors countered with the weight of corroborated evidence and the prior complaint history, arguing that the deputy's conduct was part of a pattern of on-the-spot presumption of criminality directed at people he judged. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, it was a culmination of layered proof. The camera angles, the forensic verifications, the witness testimony, and the pattern evidence together persuaded jurors to find beyond a reasonable doubt that rights had been violated. At sentencing, the presiding judge, a former Navy captain, addressed the courtroom with a line that would become emblematic of the case. "You saw only what you wanted to see." That sentence underscored a theme running through the trial and the investigation: the danger of authority amplifying perception into action. The record shows that prosecutors had originally charged counts that, in aggregate, carried a theoretical maximum of decades in prison. Whether those statutory maxima fully translated into a final term was a matter of judicial discretion and sentencing guidelines. The defendant was convicted and later sentenced. The transcript and court records should be consulted for the precise term imposed by the judge in the sentencing order. Production note: transcript contained variations in name spellings. Consistent editorial use here is Marcus Hayes and Kyle Brennan. The consequences of the case extended beyond the courtroom. Hayes sought and ultimately received an $18.7 million settlement in a civil action related to the arrest. That settlement was described in filings and press releases as recognition of injury and as recompense for the violation of his civil rights. In congressional testimony thereafter, Hayes recounted the arrest and its aftermath, his tone measured but resolute, calling attention to how the system allowed the incident to occur and stressing the need for clearer protections for service members and civilians alike. Legislatively, the story fed into action. Lawmakers introduced and later advanced a measure called the Service Member Protection Act. The law's goals, as reported, were to strengthen protections for active duty service members facing wrongful detention and to clarify jurisdictional pathways when incidents involved uniformed personnel. Training reforms also followed. The county sheriff's office, criticized in reviews for lapses in complaint management and officer oversight, revised its internal processes, and Sergeant Mike Torres, the booking sergeant whose quick verification effectively corrected the immediate harm, was later assigned to lead civil rights training within the department. Other agencies, including the Pentagon, announced adoption of helplines and liaison protocols to ensure military-civilian incidents would be escalated more quickly in the future. According to records referenced in the investigation, training updates modeled on this case were rolled out in multiple states, reported as adoption in 47 states, and the Pentagon implemented a hotline to handle reports involving service members. Where the record was uncertain about specific nationwide mandates, such claims are presented as reported outcomes tied to the case. If any detail is in question, it should be verified against the public notices and implementation reports from the agencies involved. The man who had been accused, Deputy Brennan, did not walk away unaccountable. He was convicted in federal court, and per court records and reporting, was sentenced. The precise length of the sentence as entered by the judge should be confirmed in the official sentencing transcript. The broader fact is clear. The federal process produced criminal accountability in addition to the civil settlement. Beyond individual outcomes, This case raises a troubling systemic question. Marcus Hayes walked away with verification of his identity, the ability to call on Navy channels, legal representation, public platform, and, crucially, video evidence that a jury could see and verify. He had medals that drew attention to his career. He had colleagues and institutional allies who could elevate the case to the Pentagon and to federal prosecutors. How many people subjected to similar treatment do not have one or more of those advantages? How many are alone at a gas pump with no one willing to step forward, or with a recorded complaint that never leaves a dusty folder in a precinct file room? That is the deeper sting. The case did not expose only the failings of one deputy. It revealed a system in which prior complaints can fade into administrative limbo, in which a citizen's phone is sometimes the last line of defense, in which an officer's perception can become the catalyst for humiliation or worse. It also showed that the presence of corroborating evidence, multiple camera angles, expert forensic checks, an officer in booking willing to verify, can make the difference between dismissal and federal prosecution. There are hopeful elements, and they are real. The federal conviction sent a message that civil rights violations by public officials can be pursued beyond local politics. The civil settlement acknowledged harm in a manner that provided Hayes with financial redress and public recognition of the wrongdoing. Legislative and training steps, whether undertaken at the county level, as part of state law updates, or within Pentagon procedures, reflect institutions reacting to a moral and operational failure with changes intended to prevent repetition. But reform is not automatic, and accountability that rests on exceptional circumstances is brittle. Hayes's case mobilized broad attention precisely because the evidence lined up, and because the subject was a decorated officer whose story resonated widely. Countless others lack those alignments. The video that propelled this case could just as easily have been lost, corrupted, or never uploaded. The Marine bystander who placed a hand over his heart might not always be present. Booking sergeants like Mike Torres might not always act as promptly. The reality is that systemic bias and institutional inertia can produce outcomes that repeat again and again on lives that do not receive the attention that Hayes's did. So what should the public take from this episode? First, that citizen oversight matters. The proliferation of handheld cameras has changed the evidentiary landscape in profound ways. It can be the difference between an allegation and an enforceable record. Second, that institutional reflexes matter. The choice by a booking sergeant to verify status and act can correct a wrong in minutes, but it should not be the only safeguard. Third, that federal civil rights statutes exist precisely for cases where local processes fail to protect constitutional guarantees. Their use here illustrates both their power and the difficulty of relying on them as the first line of defense. And finally, a call for measured civic vigilance. Systems change when citizens demand it, when lawmakers respond to documented failures, and when institutions adopt policies that endure beyond headlines. That is the tightrope between hope and caution. We can point to concrete reforms that followed this case: new training, legislative response, a high-profile settlement, and we must also ask whether those changes will become durable practices rather than episodic corrections. In the meantime, some concrete lessons emerge from the evidence chain that secured accountability in this case. Verification tools like RFID and UV checks should be routine at booking, not discretionary curiosities. Complaint files should be audited and aggregated to identify patterns before they culminate in harm. Departments should adopt transparent policies for escalation when incidents involve active-duty military personnel, recognizing that uniformed service confers a specific status that intersects with civilian policing. And training must emphasize restraint and verification over presumption. Marcus Hayes continued to serve after the trial. He returned to duty, and according to public records and reporting, rose in rank to command positions, a testament to resilience and to a career that did not end on a hot patch of pavement. Sergeant Mike Torres, who did what the procedure required in booking, moved into a role leading civil rights training, an example in many accounts of how individual action within a department can produce constructive change. Deputy Kyle Brennan's conviction and sentence stand as a legal consequence for conduct that the jury found criminal under federal law. The larger moral remains. Authority must be tethered to accountability. Cameras, witnesses, forensic checks, and federal statutes all contributed to a unique convergence that produced redress. But the central unsettling question remains: how many people never get that convergence? How many kneel in silence, unseen and unvindicated? If this story matters to you, share it with someone who cares about accountability in policing and the protection of service members. Talk to your local representatives about complaint oversight and training standards. The case of Marcus Hayes shows what is possible when evidence, institution, and public attention align, and it also shows how fragile that alignment can be. Thank you for watching. If you found this account important, share this video and keep the conversation going. Stay alert, stay informed, and stay engaged.